Robert Baratheon sat upon the Iron Throne with a grin that brightened every shadow in the great hall of the Red Keep. He was a king at ease, as if the weight of the crown no longer bowed his broad shoulders. It was a rare sight to see his eyes gleaming not with the wine-soaked haze of revelry but with the satisfaction of a man who had fought hard, won his crown, and found both wisdom and friendship to guide him through the thorny labyrinth of rule. Lord Eddard Stark, the new hand of the king, stood quietly off to one side, observing his friend with a staid composure that belied the swirl of feelings in his own breast. The rebellion was done, the Targaryens had been ousted, save for 2 young exiles lost across the sea. A time of peace beckoned. A golden age, perhaps, to be forged by these 2 men bound by years of brotherhood and tested by the dire forge of war. No men could be more different. Robert with his booming laugh, lusty appetites, and thirst for merriment, Ned with his quiet sense of honor and deep, watchful eyes. Yet they had proven their devotion to each other on the battlefield, and there was a bond there that not even the most cunning or malignant political whisper could break. Robert recognized it as more precious than gold, and Ned, though reluctant to sit in the thick of politics, likewise saw that his friend needed him. The realm needed him. And so, as he took up the badge of the hand, Ned made a solemn promise to serve the realm with all the loyalty he would have given his own children. The only question was whether the realm, with its fractious lords and endless intrigues, would allow for the golden age Robert dreamed of. But Robert had resolved to try. He wanted his rule to be remembered not for cruelty or upheaval but for prosperity. He wanted the small folk to sing songs of fat harvests and safe roads, not of blood-drenched rebellions or rotting bodies hung from battlements. Perhaps it was the presence of Ned that reminded him of this. Perhaps it was the memory of fallen friends that softened him, or the sight of his own young son, the newly named Crown Prince Joffrey, toddling about like any curious child, unaware of the brutal cost at which his father had gained the crown. If there was a chance to build a peace so enduring that future generations would never know the horrors of war, Robert would seize it. He may have come to the throne as a warrior, but he intended to rule as something more, if not a statesman, then at least a man wise enough to listen to those he trusted. Thus began a painstaking labor, uniting the 7 kingdoms in good faith. Highgarden, Casterly Rock, Dorne, Storm's End, the North, the Vale, the Iron Islands, the Riverlands, and the Crownlands themselves. Each region presented its own challenges, its own proud lords who demanded respect, or bargains, or alliances. If any king might have faltered in such a web, it would be Robert, who cared little for the finer points of diplomacy. He preferred the tilt of a joust to the tilt of a cunning game of words. But he was no fool. He knew well that a wise man relied on those who could do what he could not. Eddard Stark had grown up in the Vale, had ties to the north, and was a man the lords of both the stormy southwestern coasts and the sun-scorched Dornish marches tended to respect. He was unyielding in his honor but willing to strike compromises for the sake of peace. That was the bedrock Robert would rest upon. So the first years of Robert's reign saw a flurry of measures. Ned Stark busied himself with reorganizing the realm's finances, something that had been neglected in the chaos of war. With the help of certain capable stewards, they began drafting new taxes that stung less for the small folk and more for the great lords whose coffers ran deep. They introduced laws to regulate trade, encouraging commerce between the southern coasts and the north so that the wealth of one region might nourish another, like different branches of the same great tree. In time, the trade caravans that once trundled along dusty roads in fear of bandits began to multiply, carrying grain, salt fish, steel, and woven goods from one end of the realm to the other. The constant threat of anarchy receded as the crown poured coin and manpower into policing the king's roads, constructing garrisons at strategic points so that roving outlaws had nowhere to hide. With each measure, the treasury, though initially strained, began to show signs of stability and growth. The lords who had bent the knee to Robert found themselves invited to King's Landing in turn. Each one offered a place at feasts and councils alike. Robert greeted them with his new brand of generosity. Lavish banquets full of roasted boar, fresh loaves, honey cakes, and strong wine. But beneath that festive atmosphere, Ned quietly worked his persuasion. He listened to each lord's concerns, validated their troubles, and negotiated terms that might see their loyalty rewarded. Some lords grumbled about a Northman lecturing them on governance. Others found Ned's calm courtesy appealing. Robert's boisterous presence and Ned's measured approach formed a complementary tapestry. Each day, More alliances were confirmed, pledges exchanged, and disputes resolved under the watchful eye of the Hand and the king. To ensure the security of the realm, Robert directed that the navy be revitalized. He had once neglected the seas, focusing on land battles and tournaments, but Ned reminded him that the Iron Islands, though subdued, remained a restless place. And across the narrow sea, exiled Targaryens still lurked, powerless for now, but rumor said that the exiles found new ways to gather coin or perhaps the interest of the Dothraki horse lords. Ships were commissioned from the master shipwrights of the Arbor, the royal docks of King's Landing, and even the harbors of Lannisport. Before long, the royal fleet began to match, if not outnumber, the old might of House Velaryon from days past. Robert might have disliked the idea of building warships in a time of peace, but Ned persuaded him that strength was the surest guarantee of peace. With the roads patrolled and the seas guarded, merchants and fishermen alike found confidence in the new king's reign. Not all was accomplished by policy alone. Robert, though older now, still relished the thrill of the tournament. Yet these events, too, served a purpose beyond sport. When the king announced a grand tourney in celebration of peace, it wasn't just to see knights break lances and lords gamble on justs. It was a chance to display to all corners of the realm that the new era was worth investing in. Knights from every house came, from Dorne to the Neck, from the Vale to the rocky spires of the Westerlands. There were feasting and dancing, whispered alliances and open challenges. A smaller man might have let jealousy cloud him. Some said Ned Stark, as the Hand, garnered more respect among certain highborn circles than the king himself. But Robert laughed such rumors away. He knew he was not the clever one, nor the patient one. That was why he had Ned. And so, while the realm gossiped about the stark difference in their temperaments, the two men worked together seamlessly, forging deals amidst the flags and banners of the tournament. It was in one such tourney, some 4 years into Robert's reign, that a crisis threatened the delicate web they had begun to weave. Lord Tyrell's champion was unhorsed by a young hedge knight who bore no crest on his shield, and in the commotion, the hedge knight was accused of insulting the Tyrell name. Tempers flared, with House Tyrell's knights threatening retribution. But Eddard intervened quietly, summoning the hedge knight and speaking to him privately, confirming the nature of the alleged insult. In truth, it was all a drunken misunderstanding. The young knight had sworn by the Seven that he meant no slight. He had only let his frustration slip when a squire ridiculed his poor armor. Ned judged the matter fairly, imposing a mild penalty on the hedge knight and insisting he apologize in the sight of all. Tyrell's pride was soothed and the situation, which might have escalated into a feud, was contained. When Robert heard of it, he clapped Ned on the back and said that even the Seven themselves could not bring as much common sense to the realm. In small ways like that, the seeds of a golden age were sown. The peasants and small folk, after years of war and upheaval, felt a renewed sense of stability. They spoke in taverns of how the roads were safer, of how gold might be made if one were clever, of how the new king was a boisterous but strong man who listened, and who had a hand as just and honorable as any man could remember. Robert himself traveled on occasion, especially to the Reach and the Stormlands, his old homeland, to ensure that no seeds of discontent were taking root. Everywhere he went, he found that the people cheered him. The war hero had become a peacetime monarch they could admire. But peace is never won without a price, and no golden age forms without shadows threatening its edges. In the Red Keep, courtiers continued to weave their intrigues. Littlefinger, the master of coin, slithered among the lords and ladies, always eager for advantage. Varys, the spy master, whispered of unseen dangers, exiled Targaryens, ambitious lords, the rumblings of the ironborn. Pycelle, the Grand Maester, murmured about the importance of tradition and alliances with the most powerful houses, all while writing countless letters with his studious old hand. Robert could not stand the politics. He was quick to anger, quick to laughter, and hated the idea that men might feign friendship while plotting behind his back. But Ned was patient, sifting through half-truths and illusions until he could discern the shape of the real threats. Where Robert raged at news of an unsavory plot, Ned calmly examined it and devised a path forward. The greatest challenge came from within, as it so often does. Cersei Lannister was Robert's queen, and though she bore him children, theirs was never a marriage of love. It was a union meant to seal the crown's alliance with House Lannister, whose gold mines and wealth were crucial to repairing the kingdom's battered economy. Over time, however, even Robert realized that the Lannisters' influence had to be kept in check. Tywin Lannister might have retreated to Casterly Rock, but his presence hovered over court like a golden lion ready to pounce. Rumors of Tywin's ambitions of hidden dealings with certain houses cropped up time and again. Robert, with Ned's guidance, made sure to politely invite Tywin to the capital to grant him honors but also to keep a watchful eye. Tywin, though proud, recognized that the old order had passed. He had bet on the Baratheon claim to succeed, and succeed it did. But he would never be a man content to fade into the background. Still, for several years, the alliance held. The Lannisters prospered under Robert's reign, and Tywin bided his time, forging advantageous marriages for his family and ensuring the Rock's coffers overflowed. Robert's children with Cersei, Joffrey, Myrcella, and Tommen grew in the gilded halls of King's Landing. Under the watchful eyes of septas and maesters, they learned lessons meant to prepare them for power. Joffrey, the eldest, showed early signs of a cruel streak, but Robert dismissed it as boyish impulses. Ned, for his part, worried about the boy's temperament and sought to provide counsel whenever he could. It was difficult, though, when Cersei controlled who had access to the prince. She was cunning enough to keep Ned at a distance where her children were concerned. Meanwhile, Ned's own family in the north thrived. Winterfell was overseen by Lady Catelyn, who wrote frequent letters to her husband in the capital. Their children grew quickly: Robb, Sansa, Arya, Bran, Rickon. They each spent time in King's Landing whenever Ned could manage it, forging connections with the royal family and southern lords, though Ned was mindful that the North's ancient customs and proud heritage must remain intact. He was a hand first and foremost, but he would never forget that he was Warden of the North. The king recognized this loyalty and sometimes half-joked that the real reason Ned was indispensable was because no southern lord could command the North's respect as Ned could. One day, after nearly a decade of Robert's reign, a new test to the Golden Age emerged. The Greyjoys of the Iron Islands began to flex their muscles again. Though Balon Greyjoy had once risen in rebellion and was crushed, rumor spread that his heir, Victarion, and his brother Euron, a reaver of ill repute, were stirring trouble on the Stepstones and beyond. Ships were reported missing, trade vessels were attacked by pirates carrying black sails. Robert, by then well guided in the intricacies of governance, summoned the royal fleet he had so carefully rebuilt. He dispatched them to patrol the waters to protect merchants and fishermen. The show of strength was enough to ward off overt aggression, but the ironborn seldom bowed quietly. Balon Greyjoy's pride, even after the death of his rebellious sons, remained unbroken. Ned journeyed to Pike on Robert's behalf, an arduous voyage across stormy seas. He met with Balon Greyjoy in his own hall among the salt-drenched stones and the 1,000-year-old bones of sea monsters that decorated the fortress. Eddard Stark's reputation as a just man carried weight even among the Ironborn, who despised the weakness of bending the knee. But they respected a man with the resolve to come to them. Ned laid out the terms clearly. The king would not suffer any challenge to his dominion, nor allow the Iron Islands to plague the seas. If Balon refused to rein in his reavers, the full might of the crown would come down upon Pike once more, and there would be no mercy this time. Yet Ned also offered the hand of peace. If Balon complied, the Iron Islands might gain certain trade privileges and the chance to rebuild their own fleet for legitimate commerce. Balon, face grim and hair whipped by salt air, did not yield easily, but he understood that Eddard Stark did not bluff. The memory of Robert's wrath still lingered in Pike's broken towers. Balon agreed to keep the peace, at least for the moment. When Ned returned to King's Landing, Robert embraced him in front of the court, praising him for his skill. The king's subjects saw once more the unity of king and hand, a partnership that had turned treacherous waters into calm negotiation. The rumor that Robert was only a figurehead while Ned truly ruled circulated in some corners, but few dared voice such a notion publicly. Even if it held a grain of truth, the realm benefited from this synergy. And though Robert at times bristled at the idea that he owed so much to Ned's steady hand, he was not so proud or foolish as to let it drive a wedge between them. Time passed, and the memory of Aerys II Targaryen, the Mad King, faded into the haze of history. The exiled Targaryen heirs, Viserys and Daenerys, remained overseas. Some whispers hinted that Viserys was trying to court the Dothraki or that Daenerys had wed a horse lord in exchange for an army. Varys's little birds sang of these developments, but it seemed more rumor than reality. Even if the Targaryens found allies across the sea, they would face a united Westeros far mightier than before. Robert would not be caught off guard, but neither did he relish the thought of murdering children. That part of him had grown distasteful of bloodshed over the years, or perhaps Eddard's moral compass had begun to rub off on him. With every letter from across the narrow sea, Robert weighed the advice of his council, yet ultimately did nothing more than strengthen his navy and keep a vigilant watch. In some quiet chamber, when only Ned could hear, Robert confessed that he hated the idea of fighting the children of Rhaegar Targaryen who might have grown into innocence that simply wanted what they believed was theirs. He had killed enough men, lived through enough war. If the Targaryens came to reclaim the throne, they would find the gates of King's Landing barred with the swords and shields of a realm not eager for a new dynasty. Until that day, Robert would not start a war on a rumor. Yet peace can be as dangerous as war in a land rife with ambition. As prosperity soared, certain lords sought to enrich themselves further, exploiting loopholes in the new regulations. Bribery in the city watch, smuggling along the coasts, corruption among lesser officials. It all came to a head when Ned uncovered a network of smugglers tied to the coin vaults of certain noble houses in the Reach. Goods were flowing in untaxed, arms were being sold without the crown's knowledge, and some of that coin was ending up in the hands of unscrupulous hedge knights. The scandal threatened to undermine years of careful financial reforms. Ned worked tirelessly to unmask the conspiracy. He partnered with the commander of the City Watch at that time, Sir Ares Oakhart, an honorable knight chosen for his loyalty, and little by little they identified the puppet masters behind the smuggling. Unsurprisingly, Littlefinger had a hand in some of the suspicious banking transactions, though the master of coin had done his best to conceal his involvement behind layers of subterfuge. However, he was too clever to be caught red-handed, and Ned lacked sufficient proof to bring charges against him. Instead, a handful of lesser lords and merchants were arrested, their fortunes seized by the crown, their lands redistributed among loyal bannermen. The scandal sparked disquiet among the courtiers, and several whispered that Ned Stark was going too far, punishing typical business. But Robert roared with approval, praising Ned's vigilance and vowing that no one would profit from treason while he was king. It was an early sign that although the realm was wealthier and safer than it had been in decades, there were always men seeking to line their pockets without regard for the laws of the land. As the years rolled onward, Robert's children grew from toddlers to young heirs learning the ways of the court. Joffrey grew more willful, Myrcella more poised, and Tommen more timid yet kind-hearted. Ned's own children, during visits from Winterfell, formed fleeting friendships, or at least polite acquaintances, with them. Arya famously clashed with Joffrey over a practice sword once, and Sansa tried her best to befriend the prince to keep the peace. Bran was fascinated by the Red Keep's architecture and once got lost among its secret passageways, causing no small amount of panic until Ned himself found the boy. Such moments of familial interaction were the seeds of the future, the next generation that would inherit this golden age if it held. Catelyn Stark, ever conscious of alliances, recognized the importance of forging strong bonds with the crown. She wrote to Ned, suggesting possible betrothals. The king and queen had plenty of ideas of their own, and though Robert was more inclined to let the children choose their own matches, Cersei was determined to see her offspring secure the most advantageous marriages. Tension arose there, for Cersei made it clear that she had little desire for Joffrey to wed a northern girl, seeing more benefit in an alliance with the Tyrells or Martells. Ned, sensing the friction, did not press. He understood that while Robert was king, Cersei held the power of a mother over her children, and she was a lioness fiercely protective of her cubs. Yet these were trifling storms in an otherwise calm sea. The roads continued to be patrolled, new trade routes brought exotic goods from the Summer Isles and beyond, and farmers found themselves able to sell their surplus at decent prices thanks to Ned's careful financial stewardship. The crown's income rose, and Robert, to everyone's surprise, did not squander it on endless tournaments. He loved a good celebration, but he had learned to heed Ned's counsel. A lavish feast every moon might empty the coffers, and they needed to maintain a surplus for emergencies, such as famine or possible war. So while the court still feasted often, the real extravagances were reserved for special occasions like the 10th anniversary of Robert's coronation. That anniversary was a spectacle to behold. The entire city of King's Landing was draped in banners of black and gold, with Baratheon stags on every corner. From the north came a sizable retinue led by Robb Stark, just on the cusp of manhood, along with Sansa and Arya. From the Riverlands came the Tullys, from the Reach the Tyrells, from Dorne the Martells, a testament to the peace that had held for a decade. Knights competed in a grand tourney that dwarfed all others, culminating in a final joust between Ser Barristan and Selmy of the Kingsguard and an unknown knight who had unhorsed every challenger in his path. Ser Barristan, though older, fought with graceful precision, and the unknown knight, revealed later to be a Dane from Starfall, was vanquished. The crowds erupted in cheers for the storied knight of the King's Guard, the living legend who had fought under the Mad King but served Robert with unwavering loyalty. During that same celebration, Ned found a moment to speak privately with Lord Tywin Lannister, who had arrived with the full splendor of the Westerlands behind him. A hush fell over their conversation, for neither man was known for idle chatter. Tywin inquired after the north, the yields of the last harvest, and the condition of the roads. Ned responded succinctly, careful not to offer more information than necessary. By the end, Tywin's thin smile spoke volumes. He recognized that Eddard Stark was not one to be manipulated easily. Still, the old lion seemed content enough for the time being, aware that his house stood to gain from continued peace. He was not about to threaten a realm so clearly united under one crown. In these golden days, one might have believed that the entire realm had forgotten the tragedies of the past. But scars remain, even when covered by the bright tapestry of prosperity. Robert sometimes spoke in hushed tones to Ned of the ghosts that haunted him, the memory of Lyanna Stark, who had died before her time, taken by Rhaegar Targaryen. The unstoppable tide of blood that had claimed so many dear friends. Ned's eyes would grow somber, but he would gently remind Robert that they had an opportunity now to make certain no more innocents suffered such pain. That was how Ned reassured himself as well, for he still felt the ache of his father's and brother's deaths at the hands of the Mad King. The tragedies of the past, they both believed, had granted them this resolve to maintain peace. So they persisted year after year. The small folk prospered, the merchants flourished, and the realm's lords had fewer petty grievances. The king traveled occasionally with his retinue, hosting smaller feasts in places like Riverrun, Highgarden, Sunspear, and the Eyrie. Always, Ned or one of his trusted bannermen accompanied him, ensuring the throne's justice was administered fairly and hearing the concerns of local folk. All the while, the children grew. Robb became a young man with a sense of responsibility reflecting the North's values. Sansa blossomed into a courteous maiden admired by many southern lords, and Arya defied convention by training with wooden swords, determined to take after the warrior heroes of the songs. Bran, though more of a dreamer, loved climbing, exploring, and discovering every nook the Red Keep had to offer during his visits. Joffrey, by contrast, grew into a proud and often spiteful youth indulged by his mother. Myrcella was as beautiful as she was gentle, and Tommen remained sweet-natured if a bit shy. Ned worried for the future, wondering how the next generation would rule once Robert was gone. But he had pledged himself to guide them for as long as he breathed. Then came the day when Daenerys Targaryen's name returned to court in earnest. Varys's whisper said she was now a grown woman, wed to a mighty call of the Dothraki with child. This call, Drogo, commanded a vast khalasar. The rumor was that Viserys Targaryen believed he could ride this wave of Dothraki warriors right onto Westerosi shores. Many doubted that the horse lords, unskilled in naval warfare, would ever succeed in crossing the narrow sea in great numbers. But the thought haunted Robert. He remembered Rhaegar, the man he had slain in single combat. He remembered the Mad King's vile threats. The Targaryen name stirred a deep hatred in him, which no amount of peace could entirely quench. He called his council, pacing before them like a restless lion in a menagerie. When they debated what to do, Robert shouted that the Targaryens needed to be dealt with. Yet Ned, calm as always, advised caution. Charging across the sea to hunt down a pregnant girl was not only dishonorable, it could provoke more chaos than it prevented. The Dothraki might only stir in full force if they had a direct cause. If they believed Robert intended to harm Daenerys, that cause would be given. But if the crown instead maintained its naval strength and watched the coasts, any attempt at invasion could be repelled. To strike first would be to spark war. And so, after a heated argument, Robert grudgingly conceded. He disliked letting any Targaryen draw breath, but he hated even more the prospect of a fruitless, expensive war. In the end, he accepted Ned's counsel not to act. Though the tension of that choice weighed on him. Time marched on, and the Targaryen crisis never erupted as many feared. The Dothraki remained more interested in raiding eastern lands, rumor had it. Viserys Targaryen was said to have grown impatient, and tension brewed between him and Khal Drogo. Then news arrived that Viserys had died under suspicious circumstances in the Dothraki Sea, leaving Daenerys alone with her barbarian warlord. This news alleviated some of Robert's fears. Without Viserys, the last male Targaryen claim died, and Daenerys was a woman far away in a land of fierce warriors. Even if she birthed a son, it would be half Dothraki, a child unready for the complexities of ruling Westeros. Many in court began to dismiss the Targaryens entirely. Robert drank heavily that night, though he refused to speak of why. Ned quietly suspected that part of his friend was relieved and another part carried the guilt of everything that had happened since the day Rhaegar took Lyanna. Thus, the Golden Age endured. Ned continued to refine the realm's institutions. He championed improvements in King's Landing, such as better sewers and water systems, remembering the precarious squalor that had once plagued the city. The population grew, drawing more commerce. Markets swelled with fruits, grains, fish, and spices. Even the poor found themselves marginally better off as charitable septas expanded their soup kitchens, and the gold cloaks, no longer riddled with corrupt men, were better trained and more disciplined. The city was far from perfect, thieves still prowled and the labyrinthine alleys remained dangerous after dark, but for the first time in living memory there was a sense that life might get better rather than worse. In the north, the watchtowers along the wall reported no unusual movements of wildlings. The Great Watchers in Castle Black, though dwindling in number, managed to keep the peace in the far north. The nights did not seem so long and cold. In the east, the Vale thrived under the watchful regency of Lysa Arryn, who had effectively replaced Jon Arryn after he passed peacefully in his sleep, an event that shook Ned and Robert both, for Jon had been like a father figure to them. Still, the Vale's mountainous roads were well guarded and the Eyrie remained secure. In the Riverlands, House Tully oversaw bountiful harvests along the Red Fork and Tumblestone. And in the Westerlands, Tywin's gold mines continued to produce treasure that glistened in the royal treasury as taxes were paid promptly. Highgarden's fields provided abundant grain, while Dorne's exotic exports, wine, spices, and citrus flowed freely into King's Landing thanks to trade treaties hammered out by Ned's steady diplomacy. But as is often said, any golden age carries the seeds of its own decline. The first sign of trouble emerged from the restless heart of Joffrey Baratheon, who had reached the cusp of manhood. Having grown used to hearing courtiers flatter him and his mother indulge him, Joffrey saw himself as a princely figure deserving of absolute submission. One afternoon, while riding along the King's Road with a small retinue, Joffrey took offense when a common farmer failed to bow quickly enough. The young prince struck him with the pommel of his sword, leaving the man bleeding. Word spread quickly, and Ned confronted the prince, reminding him that a king's duty was to protect the people, not to torment them. Joffrey scoffed, claiming the man had disrespected his station. A hush fell between them, but Ned's eyes did not waver. Even the princeling, for all his arrogance, felt a chill under Ned's unwavering gaze. When Robert heard of it, he scolded Joffrey publicly in the throne room, forcing him to offer reparations to the man. The boy seethed with wounded pride, and Cersei offered only cold silence, no doubt furious that her son had been humiliated. Robert later admitted to Ned in private that he worried for Joffrey's future rule. But what could he do? The boy was the heir after all. Ned suggested that Joffrey be taught a harder lesson, that power is a responsibility, not a toy. But Robert only shook his head and said that if he tried to discipline the boy too sternly, he would turn the entire Lannister clan against him and risk plunging the realm into another crisis. These things had to be handled delicately. That was not Robert's strong suit. As the tension around the royal family mounted, other ominous tidings began to stir in the corners of the Seven Kingdoms. Word reached King's Landing that an extremist sect of the faith, outraged by moral decay in the capital, was gathering adherents in the hinterlands. The small folk, even in good times, could be swayed by preachers claiming that the highborn had turned from the gods, that the whores and gamblers of Flea Bottom were evidence of a kingdom sliding into sin. Such men had arisen in the past, but Robert had always laughed them off. Now, as their numbers grew, with a charismatic septon who called himself the Light of Righteousness, they threatened to ignite a new brand of trouble. Tales spread of minor lords who had given these zealots shelter, seeing it as a chance to reduce the crown's influence or carve out their own slice of autonomy. Ned set about investigating. He discovered that the zealots had gained a following in parts of the Reach and the Crownlands themselves, emboldened by a rumor that the capital was rife with corruption. The king's feasts, the presence of unsavory elements in the streets, and the lavish lifestyles of some courtiers were all twisted into propaganda. The group preached that King Robert had lost the favor of the Seven, that a purge was necessary. Ned recognized how dangerous a fanatical movement could be, especially one championed by unscrupulous lords who might want to destabilize the crown. He counseled Robert to address the matter swiftly but with some measure of tact. Arresting or killing the zealots outright could make martyrs of them. Robert, letting the old warrior in him surface, suggested a show of force would bring the entire movement to heel. "We hammered down the ironborn, we'll hammer down these lunatics," he bellowed. But caution won out. Ned recommended a more subtle approach. Send loyal septons to debate these preachers publicly, to dispute their false claims, and to do so under the watchful eye of a moderate force of armed men. At the same time, quietly investigate which lords were harboring them. Offer those lords a chance to repent and reaffirm their loyalty, or face charges of treason. The plan was set in motion, and for a while it seemed to work. The zealots were exposed as fearmongers more interested in power than piety, and many of their peasant followers drifted away once the crown and the faith's official leadership denounced them. Some pockets of resistance remained, sparking minor skirmishes in remote villages, but no widespread revolt occurred. For that, Ned breathed a sigh of relief. The realm had avoided a serious conflagration, preserving the fragile peace. Meanwhile, in the far corners of the east, Daenerys Targaryen was said to have birthed a son, rumored to be named Rhaego. The child was half Dothraki, fabled to be strong and healthy, but also rumored to have died soon after birth. Conflicting stories trickled in. Some said the child was stillborn, others spoke of a curse laid by a Magi. The most fantastical rumors claimed Daenerys had walked into a funeral pyre and emerged unharmed, hatching dragon eggs in the process. Varys relayed these whisperings to the small council, unsure how much was truth and how much was myth. Robert barked a dismissive laugh at the mention of dragons. "The last dragon died long ago," he said. "Don't tell me we're to fear children's tales now." Yet part of him seemed uneasy, for the Targaryen name was linked to dragons in the annals of history. Ned, too, was uncertain, but he reminded Robert that if Daenerys had truly lost her child, the line of succession for House Targaryen was at best murky, and the Dothraki might see her as cursed. Perhaps this chapter of threat would pass without further disturbance. Life in King's Landing continued, though currents of tension simmered beneath. Ned devoted himself to finishing what he had started, establishing a governance structure that could stand strong even if Robert grew weaker or more complacent in his later years. He built up the city's watch, established codified laws against corruption, and championed the cause of the poor, ensuring bread prices remained stable. Some called him the people's hand. Others resented him for meddling in their profit-making schemes. But no one could deny the realm was more stable than it had been in living memory. If any man doubted that, all he had to do was visit the northern roads, which once bristled with bandits, and see how safe they had become under a robust crown presence. Yet, in the midst of these labors, Ned sometimes missed the north with a homesick ache. He missed the crisp winter air, the howling of wolves, the sound of snow crunching underfoot. Whenever he received letters from Catelyn, describing how Robb was learning the ways of a lord, how Arya still sparred with the master-at-arms, how Bran explored every inch of Winterfell's walls, Ned felt a pang of regret at not being there to watch them grow. He had given his oath to Robert to be hand, but a part of him longed to return home for good. Still, he remained steadfast, for the sake of the promise he had made when Robert took the throne, to guard the realm and help shape a future free of the horrors of war. In private moments, Robert would sometimes shuffle in from the practice yard, sweaty and smelling of steel, to share a cup of ale with Ned in the solar. There, away from prying eyes, the two old friends would let their masks slip. Robert would talk of how he missed the thrill of open battle, the charge of cavalry, the swing of a warhammer. He confided that, at times, the endless ceremonies and councils wearied him. Ned, for his part, spoke of the cold beauty of Winterfell and how he wished his children could run through the godwood the way he once did. They were both, in their own ways, exiles from the simpler lives they had once known. Yet they each recognized how far they had come. Robert had gained a kingdom and Ned had helped guide it. Perhaps that was the price of their shared dream. Over the years, the bond between the houses of Stark and Baratheon deepened. Though no formal betrothal was made, Cersei's objections to a union with the North remained strong. A sense of mutual respect persisted. The king often joked he'd rather have Robb Stark as a son than some prancing Tyrell lord. Ned smiled at that, but never took it too seriously. He knew Robert's moods could swing with the wind, and was careful not to stoke Cersei's ire. Yet it pleased him to know that Robert still trusted the Starks so completely. That trust was tested in the 15th year of Robert's reign, when a mysterious illness struck the crown's supply of grain. Several warehouses near the harbor had stored large amounts for the winter, but the grain was discovered to be infested with a foul rot that ruined half the stock. A rumor circulated that it was sabotage. The city panicked, fearing famine. Prices of bread soared, and the merchants insisted they had no spare grain to sell at the old prices. Unrest brewed. Ned immediately ordered an investigation, while also tasking the city watch to ensure no bread riots erupted in Flea Bottom. He approached the Tyrells as the primary producers of grain, asking them to release more from their storehouses. Mace Tyrell agreed on the condition that the crown pay a hefty premium. The negotiations were tense. Robert, outraged by what he saw as profiteering, threatened to strip the Tyrells of their titles if they withheld food. But Ned counseled him to remain measured. They needed the Tyrells' harvest, and Mace Tyrell knew it. In the end, they settled on a compromise, with the crown agreeing to pay a slightly higher price, while the Tyrells promised to deliver the grain swiftly. To cover the costs, Ned authorized temporary austerity measures in court expenditures, cutting down on the lavish feasts and extravagances. Robert grumbled but complied, cursing the Tyrells under his breath for their opportunism. But soon enough, the grain wagons began to roll into King's Landing, averting the crisis. The infestation in the docks was traced to incompetent handling by a few harbor officials who were duly punished. A small number of saboteur rumors lingered, but no concrete evidence emerged. The city breathed a collective sigh of relief. As the realm approached 2 full decades of Robert's rule, the signs of his aging were evident. He was still broad of shoulder, but his waistline had expanded. Too many feasts, too many cups of strong wine. His black hair had started to streak with gray, and he no longer found the same joy in jousting. Nevertheless, the kingdom he presided over was stable and prosperous. Relations between the great houses stood on decent, if not always cordial, terms. Wars had been avoided. Roads were maintained. The economy, though occasionally rocked by scandal, rebounded with consistent trade. And through it all, Ned Stark remained at his side, often weary but unwavering in his dedication. There came a spring day when Robert decided to ride north with a large company, intending to visit Winterfell at last. His desire to see the seat of House Stark was partly nostalgic. He had always promised Ned he would ride there, to pay homage to the crypt of Lyanna Stark, to see the land that shaped his friend. Of course, the official excuse was to cement relations with the northern lords and to inspect the watchtowers along the neck, ensuring all was well. So, with considerable ceremony, the king, queen, and the royal children set out for the north, escorted by knights, bannermen, and the ever-watchful Kingsguard. Ned rode ahead to prepare Winterfell for the royal party, feeling a quiet joy at returning home with Robert after so many years. The journey took weeks, with stops at Harrenhal and Moat Cailin. Everywhere they passed, crowds greeted them with cheers, singing praises for King Robert and the hand who had kept the peace for so long. Robert seemed invigorated by the reception, as if this was a reminder that his people truly loved him. Even Cersei had to acknowledge the adoration from the small folk, though she kept her distance, traveling in a litter with Myrcella and Sansa, who had been invited to ride with the queen's retinue. Joffrey hunted with Robert and a few other lords, enjoying the chase of deer and boar. Tommen gaped at the grandness of Harrenhal, while Arya ran off to explore hidden corridors, only to be guided back by the watchful eyes of the household guard. Finally, they arrived at Winterfell. The gray stone walls rose before them, banners of the direwolf flapping in the cold northern wind. Ned rode at Robert's side as they passed through the gates. The courtyard bustled with people eager to see the king. Robb was there at the head of the welcoming party, tall and proud in his northern furs. Bran looked wide-eyed at the spectacle while Rickon clutched his mother's hand. Servants rushed to carry the king's baggage inside, while the lords greeted each other with warm embraces. Robert dismounted with a grunt, gazing around as if trying to memorize every detail. He took a deep breath of the chill air and grinned. "Gods, Ned," he said, "I almost forgot how alive the air feels up here." Ned guided him through Winterfell's courtyard into the Great Hall. Feasts were laid out, though simpler than King's Landing extravagance. Roasted meats, hearty breads, thick stews. Cersei kept a polite smile, never truly comfortable in the drafty north, but she played her queenly role. Joffrey complained about the cold, but Robert ignored him, roaring with laughter as he regaled the hall with stories of old battles. Later, Ned led Robert down to the crypts, where the kings and lords of winter lay. They stopped at Lyanna's tomb. Robert grew quiet, placing a single white flower, impossible to find outside a greenhouse in this climate, upon the stone effigy of the woman he had once loved. Ned watched in silence, seeing the moisture gather in Robert's eyes. The memory of that heartbreak was etched in Robert's face. Then the king bowed his head and whispered a short prayer. They emerged from the crypts together, neither speaking of it, but both feeling the weight of history upon them. Over the next fortnight, Robert hunted in the Wolfswood, feasted with the northern lords, and admired the wardenship of House Stark. He marveled at how Robb handled himself. He was nearly a man grown, commanding respect from those around him. Arya sometimes joined the hunts, trailing far behind but refusing to be left out entirely. Joffrey sulked at the roughness of the northern terrain, but found some enjoyment in archery contests. Myrcella spent her days with Sansa, strolling through Winterfell's Godswood, marveling at its ancient heart tree. Tommen made fast friends with Bran and Rickon, playing games of chase in the courtyard. In these moments, it seemed that the realm could remain at peace for a generation. The Starks and Baratheons coexisted like two branches of the same oak, overshadowing the faint tremors of ambition and envy that still haunted the court. Perhaps Ned dared to think they had truly built something that would endure. Yet, as the days of the visit stretched on, a raven came bearing dire news. Word arrived that Balon Greyjoy's brother, Euron, had crowned himself king of the Iron Islands in Balon's stead, taking advantage of Balon's failing health. Worse, Euron's reavers had launched a series of raids along the western coasts, attacking Lannisport and burning ships in the harbor. The Greyjoy banners had risen, once again proclaiming independence from the Iron Throne. Tywin Lannister was calling his banners, enraged by the raid on his lands. The Golden Age, it seemed, was threatened by an old, familiar foe. Robert's initial rage was terrible to behold. He pounded his fist on the feasting table, scattering plates and cups, bellowing that he would crush the ironborn once and for all. Ned could feel the tension among the lords present, who remembered the brutality of the last Greyjoy rebellion. War was looming on the horizon once again, and the Golden Age was in jeopardy. Robert commanded that every able lord prepare for battle. He would personally lead the royal fleet to the Iron Islands, he declared, and drown Euron Greyjoy's ambitions in black saltwater. As the hall erupted in talk and clamor, Ned stood by Robert's side, the old vow echoing in his heart, to serve and protect the realm. War was not what they had worked for all these years, but if it was forced upon them, they would not shrink from it. Robert turned to Ned, eyes blazing with the fire of the old warrior king he had once been. "We'll finish this quickly, Ned, by the gods. We'll not see the Ironborn rise again." Ned nodded gravely, determined to see the realm preserved. The road ahead would be fraught with peril, but he believed in the foundation they had laid. He believed in the strength of a united Westeros, led by a king who, for all his faults, was determined to protect his people. In this moment, as war drums began to beat in the distance, the Golden Age trembled, but it did not yet crumble. Together, king and hand readied themselves for the storm, resolved to defend the peace they had fought so hard to build. And so, the great hall of Winterfell echoed with the rumble of urgency and preparing host. Men donned mail, ravens flew, and swords were sharpened. The king of the Seven Kingdoms would ride to war once more, flanked by the man he trusted above all others, and the realm waited with bated breath to see whether their 2 decades of peace and prosperity had forged a kingdom strong enough to weather the coming tempest, or whether the Golden Age, so long nurtured, would shatter under the iron clang of war. The wind whistled around the ancient walls of Winterfell, a reminder of the North's timeless endurance. Robert and Ned exchanged one look. No words were needed. They would not let this realm fall back into chaos. They had come too far, sacrificed too much. The Golden Age would endure, so long as breath remained in their bodies and so long as they stood side by side, king in hand for life. They marched from Winterfell within the week, the king determined to answer the ironborn threat with iron of his own. Robert Baratheon stood in the courtyard that frosty morning, wrapped in a heavy fur cloak, towering over most of those around him. Even at his age, past his prime fighting years, he looked every inch the warrior he had once been, warhammer in hand, thick arms corded with muscle beneath the hint of a new paunch. His eyes gleamed as he surveyed his assembled retinue. Knights in polished steel, lords displaying the crowned stag on their banners, and a fresh contingent of Stark men who had sworn to serve the crown as loyally as they served the North. Eddard Stark, by Robert's side, quietly prepared to depart as well, though his heart felt heavier. He had not spent nearly enough time at home, and now duty wrenched him away again. Yet Ned knew that the realm's stability was at stake. Euron Greyjoy had declared himself king, and if left unchecked, the ironborn might again spread havoc along every coastline from the Reach to the north. The golden age they had labored to preserve for almost 2 decades was now threatened by old ghosts of rebellion. They planned their departure carefully. Queen Cersei, along with Sansa, Myrcella, and Tommen, would remain in Winterfell for some time to continue the royal visit, though Cersei made no secret that she loathed the North's cold. Arya insisted on traveling south again with her father, though Ned forbade it. She pouted and sulked, only relenting when Robert himself knelt before her in the courtyard and told her that she must watch over her sister while the men were gone. Joffrey rode with the royal host, wearing new plate gilded at the edges, determined to prove himself a fearsome fighter at his father's side. Robb Stark, as Ned's eldest son, had a choice: remain at Winterfell as the heir and caretaker, or join the campaign. Ultimately, after long discussion, Ned elected to bring Robb along. It was time the boy learned the responsibilities of war and alliance under the king's banners. Bran remained in Winterfell, fascinated by the bustle of departure but still too young to ride to war. Rickon clung to his mother's skirts. Soon the king's host spilled out of the Winterfell gates, churning up fresh mud as warhorses, supply carts, and footmen stretched along the King's Road. Robert rode at the vanguard, flanked by lords from the Crownlands, the North, and the Stormlands, his old homeland. Ned rode to his right, silent but watchful, his gray eyes scanning the horizon and the men. At times, Robert would bellow jokes or share old tales of battles, trying to keep morale high. Yet there was a tightness in his voice. He remembered well the first Greyjoy rebellion, how Pike's walls had run red and how Stannis had nearly died among the flaming wreckage of ships in that stormy siege. The Ironborn were vicious foes on the sea, and Euron Greyjoy was rumored to be even more cunning, even more unhinged than his brother Balon. They pressed south, skirting the Neck, crossing the plains of the Riverlands, and gathering more banners at every castle loyal to the throne. In a matter of weeks, they arrived at the outskirts of Lannisport, where Tywin Lannister had assembled a formidable force of Westermen, knights, pikemen, crossbowmen, all waiting for the king's command. The Lord of Casterly Rock was not there in person but had entrusted the leadership to his son Jaime, the famed Kingslayer, who wore a gleaming suit of golden armor. That Tywin himself remained at the Rock, securing supply lines and seeing to the region's defense, was not surprising. The man was too canny to leave the Westerlands unguarded. Jaime greeted Robert with a half-mocking salute, then offered Ned a more measured bow. Though Robert disliked Jaime's airs, he respected the man's skill with a sword. Ned, on the other hand, still harbored a quiet mistrust for the Kingslayer, whose slaying of the Mad King was overshadowed by the dishonor of betraying his sworn vows. They set up camp in the fields near Lannisport, pitched hundreds of tents, and spent restless days planning the assault on the Iron Islands. The first objective was to break the Iron Fleet, rumored to be mustering under Euron's orders at Lordsport on Pike. Once the Ironborn ships were scattered or sunk, Pike itself could be besieged if necessary. Meanwhile, smaller detachments would strike at the Lesser Isles, Great Wyke, Old Wyke, and the others to subdue any outposts. The plan hinged on the royal fleet arriving in full force, bolstered by ships from the Westerlands, the Reach, and the Arbor. Word had been sent to Paxter Redwine, the master of the Arbor's fleet, commanding him to sail north as soon as possible. Though the climate of war stifled the men's spirits, the presence of so many banners, so much gleaming steel, reminded everyone that the king was not a figure to be trifled with. The might of a united Westeros was fearsome indeed. At night, the flicker of campfires stretched across the fields near the city walls. Ned often walked through the lines, speaking quietly to foot soldiers and knights alike, asking after their provisions, ensuring they had enough to eat. Winterfell's men had grown used to his stern kindness, but men from the Crownlands or from the Westerlands or even from Dorne or the Reach looked upon him with surprise. Never had they seen a hand of the king so involved in the common soldier's well-being. By contrast, Robert's roaring laughter or short-tempered outbursts could be heard from his own pavilion, where he drank with old friends or engaged in battle planning with seasoned commanders. Sometimes Ned joined to keep the strategy on course, but more often he found himself quietly performing the tasks of leadership that Robert neglected: the subtle weaving of alliances, the soothing of feuding lords, and the careful distribution of supplies. Word soon arrived that Euron's reavers had begun a series of vicious coastal raids, not only in the Westerlands but also further south near the Arbor. The ironborn took advantage of their swift longships to strike unsuspecting villages, burning them to the ground before retreating to the safety of rocky coves. Refugees poured inland. The scale of the attacks was not yet massive, but the message was clear: Euron was letting the realm know he could strike anywhere. Robert responded with an immediate order to launch the royal fleet from King's Landing and Dragonstone to converge with the Westerlands ships at Fair Isle before pushing to the Iron Islands. Ser Davos Seaworth, the famed Onion Knight, commanded a portion of the royal fleet under Stannis Baratheon years ago, but now he served the king's new admiral, a lesser-known man named Lord Valerion. Davos's skill on the seas was widely respected. Ned had insisted that the king keep him in a position of some authority, for Davos knew the coastline as well as any man alive, and he knew how the Ironborn fought. While they waited for the fleets to unite, the king's ground forces began to move west, crossing the hills and making for the coast near Case. Along the way, they quenched smaller pockets of Ironborn raiders who had dared to land. One such skirmish occurred at a rocky strand near a fishing village that had been turned to ash. Robert, mounted on a great warhorse, led the charge with his personal guard. Ned rode beside him, sword in hand, heart pounding with an old dread. He was no stranger to battle, but he found no joy in it. Yet Robert, voice booming, swung his warhammer with lethal force, sending Ironborn scattering. Joffrey rode behind them, commanded by the king to watch how true men fought. The prince looked both excited and frightened, face pale beneath his golden helm as he saw real blood and death for perhaps the first time. The Ironborn, outnumbered, retreated to their longboats. Robert barked at the archers to loose a volley, and a storm of arrows rained down. Some boats made it away. Others were found smashed on the rocks the next day. Ned surveyed the destruction. Charred huts, the bodies of villagers who had tried to flee. A smell of brine and rot in the air. Robb Stark, too, had accompanied the king, though Ned had tried to keep his son from the bloodiest front lines. Robb's face hardened as he witnessed the ravages of war. When he returned to camp, the young Stark heir said little, but the lines of his brow spoke volumes. They carried on. Over the following weeks, the king's host engaged in a brutal campaign of chasing away Ironborn raiding parties along the coast. Meanwhile, the combined fleet of the crown and its vassals surged westward, blockading major ports the Ironborn might use to refit or resupply. This war was different from the last time Pike rose in rebellion. Then, the realm was still reeling from Robert's rebellion, and the Ironborn had hoped to exploit the chaos. Now, the Seven Kingdoms were much more unified, wealthier, with roads and fleets that had been carefully nurtured under Ned's guidance. If Euron thought he could break the realm's unity so easily, he was in for a rude awakening. But the Ironborn were not fools. Euron had a reputation for cunning and cruelty. His own longship, the Silence, was said to be crewed by men whose tongues he had personally ripped out. Dark rumors traveled about him: sorcery, deals with warlocks across the sea, charms to summon ill winds. Ned took no stock in black magic, but he knew from experience that men who cultivated such fear often reveled in savage deeds. If a storm was to be conjured, it would be conjured by Euron's willingness to do anything to further his aims. At Lannisport, Jaime Lannister gathered reinforcements for a possible push to the Iron Islands themselves. It was decided that Jaime would remain in command of the Westerlands' coastal defense, while Robert and Ned would sail in the vanguard to assault Pike directly once the royal fleet consolidated. Over the next fortnight, the ships trickled in, ships from the Crownlands, from Dragonstone, from the Arbor led by Lord Redwine's captains, from the Reach under House Hightower's banners, and a handful from Dorne. The alliance that Robert and Ned had painstakingly forged paid off. Hundreds of war galleys, cogs, and support vessels anchored off Fair Isle. Morale soared at the sight of so large a fleet. Joffrey begged to sail with his father, eager for glory, but Robert gave him a stern refusal. "Wait upon the coast with Jaime Lannister," the king said. "If the Ironborn try to land again, you'll have your chance. Don't question me, boy." Joffrey, face flushed, stormed off and muttered about cowardice. Robert, in a foul temper, snapped that the prince was too green for a sea assault. Privately, Ned agreed. Sailing around Pike's jagged rocks, then laying siege, was not a task for an untested boy with illusions of grandeur. Robb Stark, too, found himself under orders to remain on the mainland with Joffrey, though Ned suspected Robb would have received the same answer if he'd asked to join the ships. The king needed both youths in reserve, far from the most dangerous fighting. Eventually, the day arrived, the great fleet weighed anchor, Robert Baratheon at its head, Eddard Stark by his side. Their flagship, the Fury, was a stout war galley painted in black and gold, deck bristling with scorpions and manned by hardened mariners. On the horizon, the other ships spread like a blanket of sails, the house sigils fluttering in the wind. A rising tide of confidence pulsed through the men, but Ned could see that Robert was tense. So many things could go wrong at sea: storms, reefs, cunning ironborn ambushes. But there was no turning back. If Pike was allowed to remain a threat, it would embolden them further. Euron needed to be hammered down swiftly. They sailed under mostly favorable winds for a few days, the weather unusually kind. Seagulls screeched overhead and men shouted across decks, adjusting rigging and preparing for the possible battle to come. Through the haze of salt spray, the jagged silhouette of Pike eventually rose into view, dark basalt towers perched upon towering stone pillars, the keep connected by swaying rope bridges. Lordsport, the main harbor, sprawled across the eastern side. This was where Euron was said to have gathered the Iron Fleet. But what they saw upon approach was ominous. Black-sailed ships drifting in the harbor, unlit beacons along the coastline as if the entire area had been abandoned or left in a ghostly hush. Robert frowned as he scanned the waters. "Where are they?" he muttered. Ned stood beside him, equally puzzled. They had expected a fierce defense of the harbor. Instead, only a few scattered figures could be seen on the docks. A sense of dread crept through the men. Could it be a trap? Davos, who stood near the railing, suggested they send small scouting galleys ahead. Robert agreed. He wanted to know exactly what they were sailing into. The scouts rowed forward, circling through the harbor, scanning for hidden ships. One was nearly trapped when a hidden chain barrier rose from beneath the water, triggered by some mechanism near the docks. The scout boat managed to escape with a frantic stroke of oars, but the message was clear: Euron might have prepared cunning defenses. Robert, furious, ordered a measured advance. The larger war galleys halted just beyond range of any potential scorpions or catapults mounted on shore. Then, in the distance, black figures began emerging from the windows of old towers near the waterfront, ironborn archers letting fly flaming arrows that fizzed and hissed into the sea. The real fight was beginning. A volley of flaming arrows from the king's fleet answered, arcing overhead to land on the docks. Smoke rose, soon followed by the clangor of assault as rowboats full of soldiers began to push forward, seeking to secure a landing zone. Robert refused to remain on the Fury. He insisted upon leading the assault in person, as was his custom. Ned followed, dread lodged in his chest. Their rowboat jolted with each wave, water sloshing at their ankles until at last they reached the wet timbers of the dock. Shouting men spilled out around them. Ironborn rushed from behind crates and makeshift barricades. Some carried wicked-looking axes and short spears, their faces painted or smeared with salt and grime. Robert, with a roar, charged ahead, warhammer cleaving through the first foe. Ned moved with practiced efficiency, parrying an axe blow and running his attacker through. Men of the Crownlands and Stormlands, behind them, surged to hold the docks. Arrows whistled. The stench of brine, tar, and blood mingled in the air. Despite their fervor, the Ironborn defenders were too few to hold for long. They retreated inland toward the rocky slopes leading up to Pike's main fortress. Robert barked for them to be pursued, but Ned advised caution. The Iron Islands were a labyrinth of treacherous terrain. If the Ironborn had simply receded, it could mean an ambush. Robert begrudgingly agreed. He signaled for the men to dig in at the harbor, secure the perimeter, and then prepare to move inland once scouts had mapped out a safe approach. Meanwhile, the bulk of the fleet remained anchored off the coast, with more soldiers disembarking in waves. Over the next 2 days, the king's forces methodically advanced, skirmishing with Ironborn raiding parties amid jagged stone cliffs. Pike's main gates were perched high above the sea, accessible by winding paths. Euron's black-sailed ships, notably the Silence, were nowhere to be found. At first, Ned wondered if Euron had abandoned Pike entirely and taken his fleet elsewhere to raid at will. But that seemed unlikely. The Ironborn took pride in defending their seat, however battered it might be. Something else was afoot. At last, a captured Ironborn warrior under duress. Robert threatened to peel his skin off, so the rumor went, revealed that Euron had indeed taken the Silence and the bulk of his best ships on a raid deep into the Reach. They'd left behind a skeleton garrison. This was a gambit, a show of defiance. While Robert besieged Pike, Euron would wreak havoc elsewhere. Ned cursed under his breath at the cunning. The realm's fleet was mostly here, blockading Pike, so the southwestern coasts might be vulnerable. But they could not simply abandon the assault. If they left Pike unbroken, the ironborn would remain defiant. They had to finish this. Robert decided they would storm Pike within days. Teams of engineers prepared siege engines, though the craggy nature of Pike's spires made it difficult to set up catapults effectively. The king himself relished the thought of scaling walls the old-fashioned way, leading men with ropes and grapnels. Memories of the previous siege danced in his mind when he had battered down Balan's defenses. Ned was uneasy. Siege warfare was messy and Pike was notoriously dangerous to assault. But every day they delayed might mean dozens of villages burned in the reach. At dawn on the third day, the assault began. Under the cover of archers firing from the decks of anchored ships, men lugged scaling ladders toward the outer walls. They had to cross a narrow causeway battered by waves below. Ironborn defenders hurled rocks and flaming oil, sending some men tumbling into the watery abyss. Robert was among the first to set foot on the causeway, protected by a large shield. Ned struggled to keep pace, mindful of the king's unstoppable momentum. If they reached the walls, there would be close-quarters bloodshed. The crash of waves against stone mingled with the clang of steel on steel. Men shouted curses, grappling on the slippery causeway. Ned was forced into a desperate duel with a tall ironborn captain who wielded a pair of curved daggers. They circled each other on the wet stones, water splashing around their ankles, every misstep threatening a fatal fall. Ned managed to pivot aside from one dagger strike, hooking his sword under the man's arm and driving it home. The ironborn captain gargled and fell into the swirling sea below. By the time Ned caught his breath, he saw Robert had already smashed his way into the first tower, forcing the defenders back. Inside, the corridors were narrow, reeking of damp and rot. Robert's men advanced, torches in hand, cutting down pockets of resistance. Eddard Stark followed with reinforcements, ensuring no door or stairwell was left unchecked. They pressed higher into Pike's labyrinth. More ironborn fell, some surrendering, others flinging themselves forward in suicidal fury. At one point, Ned found a hall stained with old blood, scattered with rotted fish carcasses. Strange symbols adorned the walls, perhaps the scrawls of men who believed in some twisted aspect of the drowned god. He felt a chill, half believing that Euron's rumored dabbling in dark arts might not be mere gossip. Despite stiff resistance, the invaders' superior numbers prevailed. The ironborn who had remained to defend Pike were gradually overwhelmed. By midday, the king's banner hung from the highest tower, a black stag on a golden field visible from far off at sea. Robert himself stood on a balcony, warhammer resting on a crumbled stone railing, surveying the chaotic aftermath. Bodies littered the courtyard below. Plumes of smoke rose from a few scattered fires. "What now?" asked Ned, stepping up beside him, breathing heavily from exertion. Robert snorted. "We hold, Pike. Send ravens to the rest of the islands, demanding they bend the knee or face the same fate. But Euron, that bastard, is still out there. He'll be raiding the Reach, the Arbor. The man is a coward, letting others die while he slits throats far away." Ned nodded, gazing at the horizon. "We should dispatch a portion of the fleet south. If Euron is harrying the coastline, the Redwynes and Hightowers can't face him alone. We need to corner him." "That's the plan," Robert said grimly. "I'll remain here, see to it that the Ironborn cease their rebellion." "You'll go with the fleet, Ned? Track down Euron. Stamp him out." Ned felt a flicker of protest. He loathed the idea of leaving Robert's side when the king was still in a precarious position. But Robert's logic was clear. Two tasks had to be carried out at once. One army to subdue Pike, one fleet to chase Euron across the seas. Ned, known for his steadiness and sense of responsibility, was the logical choice to lead the chase. If anyone could act quickly and coordinate multiple lords, it was the hand of the king. With a weary sigh, Ned agreed. Before nightfall, ravens were sent, new orders given. While Robert consolidated his hold over Pike with the main force, Ned would depart with the more mobile ships to sail south. Jaime Lannister and Joffrey would remain with a large contingent on the mainland, guarding the coasts in case Euron tried to slip back. Robb Stark, under protest, was left with Robert as well. Ned wanted him safe and also learning from the king how to hold a freshly conquered fortress. Robb had an earnest gleam in his eye at the prospect of serving alongside Robert. The boy had found the king's presence both intimidating and strangely inspiring. Ned boarded the Fury again, joined by several other key vessels. Davos, with his well-honed instincts, took command of one wing. Lord Valerion oversaw another. They set sail as the sky turned dusky pink. The wind picked up, carrying the tang of salt and the faint hush of distant waves. Pike receded behind them, its silhouette crowned by the king's victorious banners. Ned prayed silently that Robert would remain safe in those haunted halls, far from Euron's cunning blades. They sailed hard for the Reach, suspecting Euron might strike near the arbor, where the famed red wine vineyards and fleets lay vulnerable. At first, they found only the aftermath of raids. Fishing villages burnt, piers wrecked. Weary survivors recounted sightings of black-sailed longships at dawn or dusk appearing suddenly and vanishing just as fast. Euron was elusive. Still, Ned pressed on. At each port, he conferred with local lords, demanded they maintain watchtowers, and sent out swift scout ships to scour the coastline. Eventually, near the end of a storm-lashed day, a battered red wine galley limped into harbor bearing a message that they had seen the Silence and at least a dozen ironborn war galleys prowling near the Straits of Tarth well past the arbor, pushing closer to the Stormland's coast. It made little sense at first. Why venture so far east, away from the richer plunder of the Reach? Then Ned realized Euron's plan. The Stormlands were Robert's home, dear to the king's heart. If Euron ravaged them, he might draw Robert away from Pike or at least sow deeper unrest throughout the realm. With no time to lose, Ned's fleet changed course, cutting east across choppy waters, fighting foul weather at every turn. Nights were cold and sleepless. Men fell ill from scurvy and exhaustion, but Ned drove them onward, urging them to hold fast. At last, they neared the Stormland's coastline, tall cliffs, thick forests, and the imposing fortress of Storm's End perched like a silent sentinel. Ravens had flown ahead to warn the castle of an impending ironborn incursion. Stannis Baratheon, once Lord of Dragonstone, had resigned that seat years ago, but men still whispered that Storm's End was as strong as it ever was under the guardianship of the Baratheon line. They arrived to find flickers of orange light dancing along the shore. In the distance, fires. Euron had indeed begun to raid coastal settlements near Estermont and Evenfall Hall. The wind carried the faint smell of smoke. Ned summoned Davos and the other captains. They planned a swift strike at dawn, hoping to trap the ironborn ships against the rocky Stormland's coastline. If Euron was there, they might finally corner him. At first light, they found a small bay where 3 ironborn longships had moored. The Fury and 2 sister galleys moved in quietly under the cover of heavy morning mist. Archers stood ready. Shouts rang from the ironborn when they realized they were discovered. One of their longships tried to slip away, but Ned's archers unleashed a volley that cut down the rowers. Davos's galley swooped in, grappling hooks lashing the ironborn vessel, and boarded it in a matter of minutes. Another longship was set ablaze by flaming arrows. The third was boarded as well after some fierce resistance. Captives were taken, though most ironborn preferred death to surrender. Among them was a surly raider who spat out curses until the men pinned him to the deck. He confessed that Euron had indeed led them here, but the main force was further east, heading toward Massey's Hook. The mention of Massey's Hook gave Ned pause. That was near the entrance to Blackwater Bay, not far from King's Landing itself. If Euron truly dared sail that close, he might threaten the capital. Though the Red Keep's defenses had been improved over the years, a determined raiding fleet could cause widespread panic along the coast. Ned saw the pattern. Euron was playing a game of cat and mouse, forcing the king's navy to chase him in circles while sowing chaos. Ned resolved to end it. They needed to set a proper trap anticipating Euron's path. He consulted with Davos, whose knowledge of smuggler routes and hidden coves was invaluable. They guessed that Euron might skirt the coastline, lurking in hidden inlets until an opportunity arose to strike the capital or the ships approaching it. Ned spread his fleet out in a wide net, assigning ships to patrol known smuggler haunts, watch for silhouettes of black sails at dusk, and coordinate via raven or signal fires. Days stretched into nights. Tension simmered as they waited for word. Then, near the end of a gray, wind-blown day, a patrol vessel raced back with news. They had spotted black sails near Crackclaw Point, heading south. Ned seized the chance. He ordered a forced march at sea, sails straining with every gust of wind. By the time they neared Crackclaw Point, it was full night, clouds obscuring the moon. The waves roiled, crashing against the hull. If a fight happened now, it would be in the darkness, with only torches and starglow to guide them. Ned refused to hesitate. They advanced, lookouts perched high in the rigging, scanning for any sign of Euron's fleet. Suddenly, out of the gloom, a horn sounded, a deep, eerie moan that seemed to echo across the water. Dark shapes emerged ahead. Torches flared along the decks, illuminating the hateful sigil of the ironborn kraken on tattered black sails. The Silence was at the center, a grim vessel with a massive prow shaped like a bone-white skull. Euron's men began to holler, pounding oars and beating drums. The collision came swiftly. Ned had positioned his ships in a crescent formation, hoping to surround the ironborn. But Euron, cunning as ever, angled to punch through a gap in the line. War galleys smashed hulls, men grappled from deck to deck. Arrows flickered like fireflies in the night. Ned stood on the Fury's prow, shouting orders, signaling to Davos on a neighboring ship. They needed to box the Silence in. But Euron's rowers rowed with a mad frenzy, slipping between smaller vessels and ramming one of the red wine ships, splintering its side. Torches and lanterns lent a hellish glow to the scene. Fire spread on the wrecked red wine ship, men screaming as they leapt into the dark waves. The Fury maneuvered closer, aiming to grapple the Silence, but Euron's archers let fly a volley that forced Ned's men to duck behind shields. A second ironborn ship, tentatively identified as the Nightfall, came around to support Euron, ramming a smaller Crownlands galley that tried to block the escape. The impact rang like thunder. Realizing Euron might break free, Ned roared at the Fury's helmsman to close the distance. Planks were thrown across, hooking onto the Silence's rails. Soldiers rushed forward, torches waving, swords flashing in the gloom. The ironborn met them with savage glee, howling curses. Ned drew his sword, stepping onto the plank. His boots were slick with salt water, the entire sea churned with savage wind. Heart-hammering, he leapt onto the Silence's deck where close combat raged. Euron Greyjoy stood near the stern, clad in dark leather, a patch over one eye, his lips twisted in a grin of pure malice. He wore a strange crown fashioned from black iron and driftwood. In his hand was an axe shaped like a curved fong. As Ned and a handful of Crownlands knights advanced, Euron raised one hand as if in mock salute. "Well met, Stark," he purred over the din. "Come to taste salt and blood?" A knot of ironborn barred the way, wielding axes and clubs. Ned's men clashed with them, steel ringing on steel. Ned himself ducked a swing from a reaver, then pivoted to slash across the man's chest. The reaver toppled with a groan. Another lunged, and Ned caught the blow on his shield, staggering from the impact. Darkness pressed in, pierced only by the wavering glow of torches. Sparks danced where swords collided. Screams punctured the roar of wind and waves. Slowly, they fought their way toward Euron. Ned was no young man, but he still had enough skill and grit to hold his own. The memory of Greyjoy rebellions past lent him fury. He had seen the devastation these ironborn wrought on innocent villages. He would end it here. At last, Euron sprang forward like a predatory cat, burying his axe in the side of a Crownlands knight. The knight collapsed with a wet gurgle. Euron shoved the dying man away and locked eyes with Ned. They circled, water sloshing across the deck. Euron's grin stretched wide. "Such a devoted dog of the king," he hissed. "Tell me, do the old gods watch you now? Or do they cower behind their weirwoods?" Ned wasted no breath on retorts. He lunged. Steel met the curve of Euron's axe. The ironborn chieftain twisted aside with surprising agility, cackling as Ned's momentum carried him forward. Euron countered, swinging for Ned's midsection, forcing Ned to jerk his shield across just in time. The impact jarred his arm. Another ironborn attempted to flank Ned, but one of Ned's knights cut him down. Torchlight flickered, revealing the manic intensity in Euron's single good eye. They traded blows, water spraying their faces. Euron tried to hook Ned's sword arm with a vicious twist of the axe's haft, but Ned pulled back, slicing at Euron's shoulder. The blade bit shallowly, drawing blood. Euron snarled, "I'll feed your bones to the crabs, Stark." Ned pressed, ignoring the ache in his old injuries, swinging in a series of tight arcs that forced Euron to give ground. A wave rolled beneath them, making the deck tilt precariously. Both men stumbled. Euron recovered first, raking the axe in a diagonal slash that missed Ned's throat by inches. Ned responded with a thrust that nearly pierced Euron's belly, but Euron twisted, the blade only slicing into leather. All around them, men fought and died. The Silence rocked, rigging creaking overhead. Ned glimpsed Davos's galley pulling alongside, ironborn shrieking as crossbow bolts raked their deck. Euron's men were outnumbered, but they fought like men possessed. The dream of a golden age flickered in Ned's mind. So many years of peace, threatened by one mad reaver. If Euron escaped again, the raids would continue, the realm bleeding. Ned set his jaw, determined to finish it. He feigned a low slash, and as Euron moved to parry, Ned pivoted, slamming his shield into Euron's chest. The ironborn leader staggered, and Ned lunged, sword driving forward. At the last instant, Euron twisted, so the blade pierced his side rather than his heart. Euron hissed in pain, striking back with the axe. Ned raised his shield, but it was a half-second too late. The blade bit into his upper arm, drawing a spray of blood. Ned gasped at the burning shock. They locked together, weapons momentarily entangled. Euron's face hovered inches from Ned's, breath reeking of salt and old gore. The Ironborn's mouth twisted into a terrible grin as he jerked the axe free. Ned, half numb with pain, slammed his hilt into Euron's temple, disorienting him. Euron stumbled away, cursing, blood running down his face. Before Euron could recover, a swirl of Ned's knights closed in, forcing him back. One managed a deep thrust into Euron's thigh. Euron howled, turning his axe on the knight, but the deck was slick with blood. He slipped, seeding another opening. Ned, grimacing through the pain in his arm, steadied himself, inhaled, and drove his sword into Euron's chest with a savage thrust. Euron's eyes widened, shock flickering across his features. He choked, blood flecking his lips, still trying to speak. Then Ned twisted the blade. Euron collapsed to his knees, the driftwood crown tilting from his head, and pitched forward onto the deck. The Silence's captain lay dying in a pool of black water and red blood, the stormlight overhead failing to redeem his final breath. A hush seemed to fall in Ned's mind, though the battle raged on all around. He watched Euron's body, half expecting the mad ant to rise up again. But Euron Greyjoy moved no more. His men, seeing their leader fall, broke in morale. Some leapt overboard to avoid capture, others threw down their weapons. Even the knights seemed to exhale in relief. The Silence was taken. Ned stumbled, his wounded arm throbbing, blood soaking his sleeve. Soldiers rushed to him, calling for a maester. He waved them off for a moment, ensuring Euron's corpse truly lay still. Only then did he allow them to tend his injury. Davos boarded the Silence soon after, looking grimly triumphant as he surveyed the carnage. "Is that truly him?" Davos asked quietly, eyeing Euron's fallen form. "I half expected a demon's horns." Ned nodded, voice tight with pain. "He's dead. God's willing, this ends the rebellion." Davos exhaled, relief mingling with exhaustion. "We should secure the ship. Euron's personal hoard of loot might be here, and we'll need to deal with the survivors." Ned agreed, though he was beginning to sway on his feet from blood loss. Men helped him back onto the Fury, where the ship's maester stitched the gash in his arm and gave him a strong poppy drink for the pain. The rest of the night passed in a delirious haze of shouting, splashing, and the stench of burnt timbers. By dawn, the Ironborn survivors had been rounded up or fled. The battered realm's fleet, though bloodied, had triumphed. Euron's black-sailed ships were destroyed or captured. In the ensuing days, Ned's men confirmed the rumors that Euron's death left the Ironborn rudderless. Balon Greyjoy was old and ailing, Yara and Theon were not present in the Isles or had no real power. Victarion Greyjoy might still lurk somewhere, but his strength was shattered. Meanwhile, at Pike, Robert had stamped out the last embers of resistance. Ravens arrived from the king, Pike was now firmly under royal control, and those Ironborn lords who survived had bent the knee. With Euron gone, the rebellion lost its figurehead and the Iron Islands were forced to capitulate once more. The war was effectively won. Ned, exhausted and injured, gazed at the horizon from the Fury's deck, feeling the weight of relief. He prayed that the realm would remember this victory not as another scar, but as proof that the golden age they had built was strong enough to weather threats from within. Perhaps the small folk, hearing of Euron's defeat, would sleep easier. No longer would black-sailed ships haunt their nightmares. The price in blood had been high, but at least the kingdom had not collapsed into chaos. In the weeks that followed, Ned oversaw the final mop-up operations. Captured Ironborn were ferried to the mainland for trial. Some, particularly highborn captains, faced Robert's justice, while others were allowed to return home after swearing oaths of fealty. Robert made sure to levy steep reparations on the Iron Islands, intending to cripple any future attempts at rebellion. Pike itself remained under crown authority until Balon's inevitable death or abdication. Victarion Greyjoy, rumored to have survived somewhere at sea, was declared an outlaw with a price on his head. The Silence was confiscated, though many believed it was cursed. Ned had it stripped of sails, scoured, and anchored at Lannisport under heavy guard. Gradually, the triumphant hosts dispersed. Lannisport breathed easier once the king withdrew most of his army. The battered ships returned home for repairs. Eddard Stark yearned to see Winterfell again, but he knew his place was at Robert's side, ensuring the realm settled back into peace. The king decided to hold a victory gathering at Riverrun, bridging the distance between north and south to celebrate the end of the Greyjoy threat. Ned traveled there with Robert, the entire retinue moving more slowly now, grateful for the respite from urgent war marches. They arrived at Riverrun to a warm welcome by Edmure Tully, who had grown into a more confident lord since taking over from the aging Hoster Tully. Catelyn Stark journeyed south to meet Ned there, along with Sansa, Arya, and Bran, who was ecstatic to see his father safe. Robb had already been reunited with them after departing Pike with the king. The joy of family soothed Ned's weariness, though the stitches in his arms still ached. He embraced Catelyn, feeling the tension that had built up over months slip away, replaced by the comfort of her presence. Robert arrived in full regalia, stepping onto Riverrun's drawbridge to the cheers of assembled crowds. His own queen, Cersei, emerged from a gilded carriage, looking as if she had spent the entire war safe in lavish surroundings, though she made some polite show of relief. She fussed over Joffrey, who boasted of how he had helped hold the coast, despite the actual fighting having occurred far from his vantage. Myrcella and Tommen were absent, left behind at Winterfell under trusted guards. But Sansa found herself facing Cersei's cool gaze and Joffrey's smug self-regard whenever they crossed paths in the castle halls. A grand feast was held in Riverrun's great hall, the Tully fish banners hanging side by side with the stag of Baratheon and the dire wolf of Stark. Musicians played celebratory tunes. Cups overflowed with wine. Robert made a boisterous speech, praising the realm's loyal guardians, and my good friend Ned Stark, without whom none of this prosperity would be possible. Applause thundered. Ned bowed his head in humble acknowledgement. Yet, behind Robert's hale grin, Ned could see the signs of wear. Dark circles under the king's eyes, a slump to his posture when he thought no one watched. The war might have been won, but the responsibilities of rule never ceased. In the days following, Ned and Robert met privately in one of Riverrun's solar chambers, away from the festivities. Robert sank into a chair, swirling a cup of ale in his hand. "Well, old friend," he said with a wistful smile, "we've put down another rebellion." Ned sat across from him, carefully stretching his wounded arm. "Yes, your grace. The realm will breathe easier now." Robert let out a short laugh. "Remember when we were the rebels? Storming into battles, certain the gods were on our side." His expression grew distant. "We're older now, Ned. The price of these wars feels heavier each time." Ned understood. "We've done what was needed. Perhaps now the ironborn will truly bend the knee. Their strength is broken for a generation. The kingdom remains whole. Aye, thanks to you." Robert studied his friend's face. "But you've taken wounds, and I've lost good men. Sometimes I wonder if all of this weighs too heavily on a man's soul. Maybe I should let Joff do more, step back a bit. Gods know I'm not as young as I used to be." Ned's lips tightened. He thought of Joffrey's cruelty, the boy's arrogance. "Joffrey is not yet ready," he said carefully. "He needs time and guidance, or he'll bring more harm than good." Robert heaved a tired sigh. "I know. He's got the Lannister temper. Sometimes I think I should have wedded Lyanna, had my own line from her. The gods had other plans." He downed a gulp of ale. "Still, you're right. He's not ready." Ned did not reply immediately, uneasy at how Robert kept looking to the past. But at last he murmured, "We do what we must. You're still the king, Robert, and the realm needs you." Robert nodded, brow furrowed. "And it needs you as well, Ned. Don't ever think otherwise." They said little else that night. Yet the conversation weighed on Ned's mind. Robert sounded weary, and Joffrey's nature loomed as a stark reminder that no matter how strong a kingdom might be, poor leadership could unravel it. For now, they would continue as they always had, with Ned quietly steering the course and Robert's presence assuring the loyalty of the realm. But time spared no man. Eventually, Robert would grow older, weaker. Who would maintain the golden age then? They departed Riverrun soon after. Ned was relieved to escort his family back toward the north, if only for a while. But Robert insisted that Ned return to King's Landing first, at least briefly, to stabilize matters after the war. Littlefinger had remained there, managing finances. Varys still whispered of Targaryen exiles beyond the sea. Catelyn and the children traveled separately to Winterfell, accompanied by a strong guard. Ned hoped to follow soon after concluding royal business in the capital. When he arrived at King's Landing, Ned found the city abuzz with talk of the war's victorious end. The small folk admired the king more than ever. Shops were open late, merchants brought in new wares, and travelers from all over the realm moved freely along safe roads. It was a far cry from the days of Aerys II. The City Watch, under Ser Aerys Oakheart's command, had clamped down on crime. Fewer murders, fewer muggings, fewer cut purses. There was a sense that King's Landing had become, if not entirely peaceful, at least less dangerous. Ned attended a small council meeting the day after his arrival. Present were Littlefinger, Pycelle, Varys, and the rest. Robert was delayed, as always, but eventually strode in, hungover from the previous night's carousing. They discussed the distribution of spoils from the Ironborn War, lands seized, fines levied, the burden of reparations. Littlefinger smirked at the sums, rubbing his fingertips together as if tasting the gold. A healthy injection of coin into the treasury, he remarked slyly, provided we collect diligently. Ned gave him a measured look. We must be fair but firm. The Ironborn rebellion cost the realm dear in blood and coin. They must repay what they destroyed. Littlefinger shrugged. Of course, Lord Hand. My men will see to it. Robert yawned. So long as I don't have to read any ledgers. You handle it, Ned. If any of the Greyjoy brats tries to wriggle out of it, I'll have their heads. They moved on to other matters, fresh trade agreements, the possibility of new roads, the castle garrisons. As usual, Robert's attention waned. Ned carried the meeting forward, ensuring each region's needs were addressed. In the back of his mind, he felt that old tug of longing for Winterfell. If the realm's greatest danger was truly behind them, perhaps he might at last return north. But the tides of the realm seldom ceased. That very evening, as Ned was reviewing correspondence in his chambers, a guarded knock came at the door. One of the city watchmen entered with a messenger from the Narrow Sea, carrying a letter sealed in the wax of House Mormont. Ned recognized the badge, a bear. Opening the letter, he read Lady Meage Mormont's report that Daenerys Targaryen had resurfaced in Pentos, apparently allied with a cluster of wealthy magisters who opposed the might of Volantis. Rumors claimed she might attempt to sail west with a band of freed slaves from Essos. The letter's details were vague, but it was enough to put Ned on edge. He sought out Varys the next morning. The spymaster's chambers were hidden away in the Red Keep's labyrinthine corridors, smelling faintly of incense. Varys greeted Ned with a fawning bow. My Lord Hand, always a pleasure. Have you come to pluck a rumor from the vine? Ned wasted no time on pleasantries. Is Daenerys Targaryen in Pentos or not? Varys spread his hands. My little birds tell me she was indeed in Pentos. Whether she remains is less certain. She has become elusive. Some say she has the loyalty of the Unsullied, others claim she is beloved by freedmen who see her as a liberator. His eyes glittered. A rumor also suggests she has 3 dragons, small still but living. Of course, that might be the sort of story men whisper in port taverns to earn free drinks. Ned bristled. Dragons were extinct so far as he knew, but the notion of Daenerys possessing them was enough to stir old nightmares in Robert. If she sails west, we must be prepared, Ned said. But we cannot act on rumor alone. The realm is tired of war. We must confirm the truth. Varys nodded. Naturally, my lord. I have agents in Lys and Myr who may glean more. But perhaps we should also consider sending an envoy to Pentos? Quietly, of course. Ned took a moment. That might be wise. She might be open to diplomacy, if she's truly seeking a peaceful return. Yet, even as he spoke, he doubted Robert would ever accept a Targaryen on Westerosi soil. The king's hatred ran too deep. Indeed, when Ned brought the matter to Robert, the king raged. Damn all Targaryens. I thought that threat was finished. She's not welcome in my kingdom. If she dares cross the Narrow Sea, I'll have her head. Your Grace, Ned said calmly, we lack proof that she poses a threat. If we launch an unprovoked attack... Robert's face darkened. You still have a soft spot for that cursed bloodline? By the gods, Ned, we're not taking any chances. They argued, though not as fiercely as they once might have. Ned managed to calm Robert, extracting a reluctant promise to wait for more solid information before sending assassins across the sea. The realm had just concluded one war. Ned did not want another wave of bloodshed on speculation alone. They parted with tension in the air, though Robert eventually agreed to let Ned handle matters with caution. Days turned into weeks. Tidings from the west reported that the Iron Islands were quiet. Balon Greyjoy, ill and broken, had accepted humiliating terms. News from Dorne spoke of mild unrest due to old grievances, but nothing dire. The Vale thrived under Lisa Arryn's stewardship, though there were occasional border disputes with mountain clans. The Westerlands were calm, Tywin Lannister's iron-fisted rule ensuring no brigands lurked in his domain. The seeds of winter had not yet bloomed, and the realm still basked in the afterglow of relative prosperity. Yet in the Red Keep, tensions lingered around the royal family. Joffrey strutted about, verbally tormenting lesser courtiers, sometimes picking fights with squires. Myrcella and Tommen, less visible, continued their studies. Cersei made no secret of her dissatisfaction with living in the shadow of Ned Stark's popularity and Robert's unpredictable moods. The court was a hive of whispered intrigues, with courtiers angling for advantage. Ned had grown used to this environment, but that did not make it any less draining. As the year turned, Robert announced a grand tourney at King's Landing to celebrate the victories of the past year and to encourage unity, as he put it. Tournaments were always a costly affair, but the king insisted it would bolster morale. Ned sighed, recalling how often he had tried to rein in Robert's love of spectacle, but perhaps a measure of celebration was warranted. The city welcomed knights from every corner of Westeros, pavilions sprang up along the tourney grounds, and merchants hawked their wares. The days leading up to the event were filled with music, dancing, and feasting. Ned busied himself with administrative tasks, ensuring the city watch could handle the influx of visitors and keep the peace. He also oversaw the correct awarding of prizes. Robert had promised substantial purses for the joust, the melee, and the archery competition. If the treasury was to endure such lavish spending, the details had to be handled carefully. Littlefinger offered to assist with the finances, smiling that thin smile of his. Ned, wary but pragmatic, allowed him to do so, making sure to double-check the figures. On the first day of the tourney, the stands filled with lords and ladies in their finery. Bright banners snapped in the wind. Minstrels played lively tunes. Joffrey, resplendent in a gilded doublet, sat beside his mother in the royal box. Robert, clad in half-armor with a golden cloak, drained cups of wine and cheered at every lance shatter. Ned sat to the king's right, scanning the crowd, occasionally engaging in polite conversation with nearby nobles. Arya, who had joined her father for a short stay in King's Landing, watched wide-eyed from a place of honor, thrilled by the pageantry even though she mocked the fancy outfits. Sansa was absent, having chosen to remain in Winterfell to help Catelyn host some northern bannermen, which eased Ned's mind a little. Sansa had always been enamored of Joffrey in the past, but that sentiment had cooled with each display of the prince's cruelty. The justs were fierce. Knights from the Reach dominated early rounds, with Loras Tyrell and other flower-bedecked champions unhorsing lesser-known challengers. Yet the Vale boasted a dark horse contender in Ser Michael Redfort who advanced impressively. Jaime Lannister, too, took the field in shining gold and white armor. The crowd roared at the sight of the Kingslayer. Joffrey watched with excited malice, evidently hoping to see someone violently unhorsed. Ned tried to maintain an air of decorum, but a sense of unease simmered. Something about the swirl of courtiers, the tensions in the stands, and the undertones of political maneuvering put him on edge. He noticed a few lords from the Crownlands whispering with envoys from the Westerlands, their faces tight with the fervor of some secret scheme. Another time, he saw Littlefinger moving among the highborn, smiling knowingly. Perhaps it was nothing more than the usual intrigues. But Ned had learned not to ignore his instincts. On the second day of the tourney, the melee overshadowed even the jousting. Dozens of men fought in an open field, steel clashing on steel, while the crowd roared. Robert loved it, bellowing encouragement. Joffrey shouted for blood. Arya watched with rapt interest, leaning forward in her seat. Near the close of the melee, an altercation broke out off the field. Some hedge knight accused a landed knight of cheating, and both men ended up in a scuffle, swords drawn in the spectators' area. The city watch rushed to separate them, but not before a bystander was wounded. Ned frowned. The watch seemed slow to respond. That night, he took the commander aside and discovered that bribes had been circulating among the watchmen. Some had grown lax in the flush of post-war prosperity. Ned promptly ordered an internal review, ensuring that those found negligent would be dismissed. The final day saw the jousting finals. Loras Tyrell faced Jaime Lannister in a much-anticipated match. The stands overflowed. Robert guzzled wine, ignoring Ned's pointed looks. Cersei sat rigid, regal, occasionally glancing at Jaime with something akin to pride. The horses thundered, lances lowered. Jaime unhorsed Loras in a brilliant clash, the young Tyrell tumbling heavily to the ground. Jaime dismounted gallantly, helped the bruised Loras to his feet, and accepted the victor's purse from a gleeful king. That night, a feast was held in the Red Keep, with Robert crowning the Queen of Love and Beauty, though, conspicuously, not his own wife, instead choosing to crown an unnamed maiden rumored to be a lord's daughter from the Stormlands. Cersei's face was thunderous, though she concealed it behind a forced smile. Yet, for all the drama and hints of tension, the tourney ended without a major incident. The small folk went back to their homes with fresh tales to tell, the knights departed with pockets lighter or heavier than before, and Robert declared the festivities a grand success. Ned breathed a quiet sigh of relief. However, he could not shake the feeling that these fleeting celebrations only masked deeper fractures that might one day threaten the realm again. He had built systems of justice, roads, trade policies, but had he done enough to instill a lasting unity beyond Robert's lifetime? He lingered in King's Landing a while longer, tying up administrative loose ends. Letters from Catelyn begged him to return home soon. She wrote of winter's approach, not an immediate threat but enough to stir the north to caution. She also mentioned that Sansa had shown interest in traveling south eventually, perhaps to see the capital again, though Ned suspected Sansa's illusions about courtly life had been tarnished by Joffrey's behavior. Arya was restless in Kingsell. Anding, enjoying her occasional dancing lessons with Syrio Farrell, though Ned had a suspicion those lessons had grown into something more akin to actual sword training. Finally, Ned arranged for a small retinue and departed the capital, leaving the realm's day-to-day affairs in the King's Council's hands. Littlefinger oversaw finances, Varys watched for threats, Pycelle saw to rosters of new City Watch recruits. Robert was content to remain in the capital for now, though the king talked of a progress to the Stormlands or the Reach come spring. Ned offered his usual caution, traveling too frequently drained the coffers and unsettled the seat of power. Robert waved him off with a chuckle. The ride north was a balm to Ned's soul. The crisp air, the chatter of soldiers, the steady beat of hooves on the King's Road, these were old comforts. Arya rode at his side, occasionally galloping ahead to test her mare's speed. She peppered him with questions about the old days, about battles and rebellions. Ned answered patiently, cautioning her that war was never glorious, no matter how the bards sang of it. Once they passed a ruined watchtower near the Trident, remnants of the War of the Nine Penny Kings, and Ned used it as an example of how war's scars linger long after the songs have faded. They reached Moat Cailin in a downpour, the ancient fortress looming out of the bog. Northern men greeted them warmly, offering the best they had. Ned felt a wash of relief crossing into the north. Soon, they were riding through the familiar pine forests and along the banks of clear streams. At Winterfell's gates, Ned found his wife and children awaiting him, their faces alight with joy. The comfort of home wrapped around him like a warm cloak. Despite his duties as Hand, Ned managed to remain in Winterfell for nearly half a year. He and Catelyn busied themselves with the tasks of running the Great Castle, meeting with bannermen, and seeing to the harvest before the first snows. Sansa had matured noticeably, having spent many months without the distraction of Joffrey's courtship. She carried herself with a dignified air, learning the art of diplomacy from her mother. Arya, on the other hand, continued her fascination with swordplay, occasionally begging visiting warriors to show her a new thrust or parry. Bran scurried through the castle's towers, always exploring. Rickon still clung to childhood joys, chasing after the dire wolves. Robb, nearly a man grown, took on more responsibilities, aiding with local disputes, overseeing training in the yard, and forging the loyalty of younger bannermen. Ned cherished these days, though he knew they would be short-lived. He was Hand of the King, and the realm had constant needs. Ravens arrived periodically from King's Landing with new updates. Increased trade with the free cities, the appointment of new justices, rumors of Sellsword companies moving along Essos. Robert wrote occasionally in a bold hand but with meandering messages, talk of hunts, of bickering at court, of how he missed the old days when they could simply ride and fight without the burden of politics. Ned always replied with sober counsel, urging him to remain vigilant. The Golden Age had survived the Greyjoy threat, but new storms could form at any time. Eventually, another crisis pulled Ned south once more, a series of murders along the Gold Road, near where it linked the Westerlands to the Crownlands. Merchants were found slain, cargo stolen. A rumor pointed to a group of bandits claiming to be Robert's rightful heirs, possibly implying another pretender with some distant tie to the Baratheon line. Whether it was a real claimant or a simple ruse, the matter needed the firm hand. Robert was losing patience, and Ned suspected the king might order a heavy-handed response that could anger local lords if not handled with care. So Ned said farewell to his family again. Robb offered to accompany him, but Ned advised him to remain at Winterfell, continuing to learn how to lead in the North's unique conditions. This time, Sansa and Arya both chose to travel with him, Sansa eager to see more of the courtly world now that she was older and presumably wiser, Arya simply bored with winter preparations and longing for more adventures. Catelyn stayed behind to watch over Bran and Rickon. Ned kissed her goodbye in the Godwood, promising to return as soon as he could. The ride south was uneventful until they approached the crossing where the murders had taken place. Indeed, they found a fresh scene of horror, 2 merchant wagons burnt, corpses left rotting. Ned felt a tightness in his chest, fury mingled with disgust. This in a realm that was supposedly enjoying an era of peace. He ordered the local knights to spread out, gather any clues, and root out the bandits. Over the next few days, they captured several outlaws lurking in a nearby forest. Interrogation revealed they were men of no special lineage, simply desperate criminals seizing on the rumor of a possible pretender to sow terror and confusion. Ned commanded swift justice, a public trial followed by hangings where guilt was proven. Though the bandit threat seemed contained, Ned worried about how quickly local lords had let the roads become unsafe. It was a reminder that vigilance could never wane, even in prosperous times. After ensuring that more patrols would be established, Ned continued on to King's Landing, resolved to tighten the laws or improve the enforcement structure if needed. With him rode Sansa, pensive about the grim display of the bandits' fate, and Arya, who tried to appear hardened but could not hide the horror in her eyes as the nooses snapped. When they reached the capital, it was late autumn. The Red Keep's red stones glowed in the setting sun. The city was bustling as always, though the crowds wore heavier cloaks against the chill. Ned noticed new watchtowers had been built along the city's outskirts, a sign that someone at court was listening to his earlier pleas for better defenses. He found Robert in the throne room, hearing petitions. The king sat on the Iron Throne, one leg slung over the side, looking bored out of his mind, while a thin man in expensive robes droned on about a tariff dispute. Ned's arrival caused a stir. Courtiers murmured, bowing as he passed. Robert brightened, dismissing the petitioner and lurching to his feet. He embraced Ned in a one-armed hug, ignoring the squeak of protest from Pycelle and others. "Gods, it's about time you came back, Ned," the king boomed. "I've half a mind to hand you this damn chair and go hunting." The next few days saw Ned settling back into his role as Hand. He rejoined the small council, gleaned what had transpired in his absence, and set about reinforcing some decrees for road safety. Littlefinger grumbled about increased spending, but Ned would not compromise on protecting travelers. Varys reported that the Targaryen girl had been sighted in Slaver's Bay, gathering freed slaves under her banner. Some said she was forging alliances with cities that had broken from the old Valyrian traditions. No one knew for sure if she had dragons, but the rumor persisted, fueling speculation. Robert sniffed that it was all nonsense, and that even if she did have lizards, she wouldn't dare cross the sea. As the days turned to weeks, Ned felt the familiar burdens of the capital settle around him like a heavy cloak. The politics, the intrigues, the subtle dance of alliances, it left little time for peace. Yet he pressed on, for he believed in the kingdom they had built. The roads were safer than in living memory, trade blossomed, and the harvest had been good in most regions. The small folk, if not living in luxury, at least had fewer reasons to starve or fear nightly raids. If that was not a golden age, it was at least a reprieve from the nightmares of war. Sansa found herself courted by a few young knights, though she was more guarded than her earlier naivete with Joffrey. She politely deflected them, focusing on her studies in needlework, languages, and the art of managing a household. She had grown into a graceful girl, if still a touch dreamy. Arya, meanwhile, roamed the Red Keep, practicing her footwork under the watchful eye of Syrio, sneaking off to the city whenever she could. She refused to be confined by a lady's responsibilities, much to the exasperation of Septas. Ned did his best to strike a balance, allowing Arya some independence while insisting she maintain a modicum of decorum. Another year slid by in this manner. Occasional troubles flared, a minor revolt in the Vales Mountains, a dispute between the Tullis and Freys over river tolls, rumors of ironborn reavers testing the seas once more. But none escalated into major conflict. Robert sometimes complained of growing old, longing for the rush of combat, yet he also seemed to enjoy the fruits of peacetime, indulging in feasts and hunts without the pressures of a looming rebellion. To the surprise of many, Tywin Lannister eventually visited King's Landing at Robert's invitation for talks on extended trade agreements and to see how the realm might better guard against future ironborn raids. The Old Lion's presence cast a long shadow in the Red Keep. Ned remained cordial but cautious. The memory of Tywin's brutal sack of King's Landing during the rebellion lingered. Nonetheless, the meeting went smoothly. Tywin made sure the Westerland's mines kept the crown's coffers flush, and in return, Robert granted certain shipping privileges. One evening, as Ned paced the courtyard for fresh air, he noticed Tywin observing the training yard. Joffrey was there, half-heartedly sparring with a practice blade against a wooden dummy. Tywin's face betrayed no emotion, but Ned guessed the old lion was unimpressed. Later, Tywin quietly commented to Ned, "A king's heir must learn discipline. If he cannot govern himself, how can he govern others?" Ned could only nod, uncertain if Tywin was needling him or simply speaking a hard truth. Days after Tywin departed, a quiet gloom settled over Robert. He confided to Ned that the Lannisters' hold on the royal family still left him uneasy. Cersei's aloofness, Joffrey's faults, and Tywin's watchful gaze all weighed on the king. "Sometimes I miss the days when it was just us, Ned, two boys in the Vale, daydreaming of glory." Ned tried to offer some comfort, reminding Robert that the realm was at peace largely because of alliances such as the Baratheon-Lannister union. For better or worse, that union had stabilized the throne. During these months, Ned made another push to improve city infrastructure. A new granary to store surplus harvest, expansions to the city's aqueducts, better drainage. He met with the Master Stonemasons Guild, hammered out wages, and employed laborers from Flea Bottom at fair rates. Some courtiers questioned the expense, but Ned stood firm, pointing out that an epidemic or famine in the city could destabilize the entire kingdom. Robert, half amused, authorized it. "Anything to keep you from nagging me, Ned," he joked. "Though I'd rather spend the gold on feasts." Bit by bit, the improvements took shape. The city grew safer, cleaner. The sewers no longer clogged as often, and the risk of plague decreased. Bread remained affordable for most, thanks to the granaries. Traveling merchants said King's Landing had changed from a squalid pit into something approaching a proud capital. The small folk began to call the king Robert the Bountiful or Robert the Generous, though Ned knew the man behind those titles was just as capable of savage outbursts. Still, this was the best face Robert had ever shown to the realm, and it had endured longer than anyone might have hoped. All the while, Ned kept an ear out for news from across the sea. Whispers drifted in from Pentos, Astapor, Ukiah, places known for the slave trade. Daenerys Targaryen, the so-called Mother of Dragons, was said to be liberating slaves and forging a new power base. Some ships from Westeros that traded in those waters returned with wild tales of unsullied armies and glimpses of winged shadows. Ned refused to believe such rumors without proof, but it concerned him nonetheless. If Daenerys truly built an empire of freed slaves, she might eventually turn her gaze on Westeros. How would Robert respond if a Targaryen queen arrived not as a frightened exile but as a conqueror with thousands of devout followers? Ned considered discreet envoys. He had once proposed that the realm send someone to treat with her, test her intentions. But Robert would not hear of it. To him, all Targaryens were monstrous foes. "I'll not bend the knee to that lot," he growled. "We hammered them once, we'll hammer them again if they dare set foot on our shores." Ned wondered whether such bluster might one day be tested. For now, the threat remained distant. The realm had enough on its plate. As yet another turn of the seasons approached, Ned found himself reflecting on how many years he had served his hand. Nearly 2 decades since Robert first seized the throne. He thought of how Rhaegar Targaryen had once been the fearsome prince, the threat that drove Robert to rebellion. That ghost was long gone, but new ones always replaced the old. The realm kept spinning, too large and complex for any one man to master. But Ned took solace in the knowledge that he had helped build a framework for peace, safer roads, enforced justice, improved finances, strong alliances. The small folk at least reaped some benefit, no longer crushed under endless war. In the great hall of the Red Keep one evening, Ned found Robert alone, sprawled in a chair near the hearth, a goblet in hand. The king's hair was more gray than black now, his once massive shoulders hunched slightly. He looked up as Ned approached, offering a slow grin. Come to scold me for drinking alone? Ned shook his head, a faint smile playing on his lips. Hardly. I was just thinking how far we've come. Robert snorted, gazing into the fire. Aye. We were boys once, both of us. His expression turned wistful. All those battles, all that blood, and yet here we are, lords of a peaceful kingdom. Maybe the gods do have a sense of humor. Ned settled into a nearby seat. If it is humor, it's a cruel one. Still, better peace than war. Robert drained his goblet, setting it aside. I couldn't have done it without you, Ned. Never forget that. You've kept me from drowning in politics, kept the realm stitched together. You, and your unwavering sense of right and wrong. Silence stretched, broken only by the crackle of logs. Ned felt a swell of emotion at his friend's words. Time and again, people had tried to drive a wedge between them. Yet the bond from their youth had endured, tempered by the trials of rule. The realm's golden age, such as it was, stood as a testament to their combined strengths, Robert's charisma and martial prowess, Ned's integrity and diligence. Robert sighed. I'm tired, Ned. Tired of the feast days, the courtiers whining, the endless demands for gold. Some days I just want to ride away. Let the wolves have the city. You must stay the course, Ned said gently. The realm needs stability, needs your presence. We've come too far to throw it away. I know, Robert muttered, but promise me something. When I'm gone, you'll keep it safe. You'll keep the wolves at bay. Ned's mouth went dry. He reached out, grasping Robert's forearm. You'll be with us for many years yet, Your Grace. Robert managed a soft laugh. Don't coddle me, friend. I'm not dead. Not yet. But if that day comes, see to it my son doesn't ruin everything. Ned didn't answer right away. He thought of Joffrey's cold eyes, of Mycella's gentle heart, of Tommen's shy kindness. One day, Joffrey would inherit the throne unless something changed. Ned forced himself to speak. I swear I will do my duty, as I always have, for the good of the realm. Robert nodded, satisfied for now. They sat there, listening to the fire hiss and pop, two old companions who had shaped the fate of a kingdom. And so the years continued, with Eddard Stark serving as hand for life, Robert Baratheon presiding over a realm that bore the marks of both men's influence. Fewer wars erupted, fewer peasants starved, bandits found less room to thrive, and roads across the Seven Kingdoms bustled with trade. For some, it was indeed a golden age. For others, it remained a time of struggle. No king's reign could ever be perfect. But in the annals of Westeros, when later generations looked back, they would speak of King Robert's era as one of the longest stretches of relative peace since the Targaryen conquest itself. In the far future, whether Daenerys Targaryen arrived with dragons or not, whether the White Walkers rose from the frozen wastes, whether new intrigues formed in the shadows, one truth would remain: the forging of that golden age had changed the course of history. The once mighty warrior who had worn the crown like a man bearing a yoke had found a friend to share its weight, and the man of honor who had accepted the burden had done so with humility and perseverance. Together, they had shaped a realm where small folk could dream of better tomorrows, where lords might find fewer excuses to draw swords, and where the memory of war was overshadowed, at least for a time, by the glow of prosperity. Thus did Robert Baratheon and Eddard Stark, bound by old bonds of brotherhood and tested by the flames of rebellion, stand at the apex of the Seven Kingdoms, showing that, for all the tragedies and betrayals of the past, men of honor and friendship could carve out years of peace amidst the harshness of a land that seldom forgave the weak. And though new generations would bring their own challenges, the lessons of their golden age would echo through the halls of power and the dusty roads, reminding all that leadership born of loyalty, tempered by justice, and guided by compassion could, if only briefly, keep the storms of Westeros at bay.